Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Noreen Das, and I am the Country Manager for MIT India, a program within the MIT Science and Technology Initiatives, also known as MISTI. As you would have just seen in this promo, MISTI provides both undergraduate and graduate students from all our schools and colleges on campus with immersive 10 to 12-week research and internship opportunities in over 25 countries during the summer months. Over the last 22 years, the MIT India program has contributed to India's existing and emerging needs by providing MIT students and faculty an opportunity to be at the forefront of India's research, technology, and innovation activities. Today, we are delighted to host this event to showcase two recent graduates, Radhika Singh and Shahel Joshi's work on rivers in water-scarce regions of India, and hear from experts in the field too. Just a quick note on the format. We'll be hearing from our panelists first before we move to the Q&A section. So please do keep note of your questions as we go along. We are honored to have Dr. Shahana Chattaraj serve as our moderator today. Shahana is an interdisciplinary social scientist and policy researcher, and currently serves as Director of Research, Data, and Innovation at World Resources Institute, India, and is a visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. Her current research projects look at how cities can work better for migrant workers in India, women's economic opportunities in the platform economy, and refugee outcomes in cities across Europe. Shahana has held fellowships and taught in policy and planning programs at the University of Oxford, the University of Pennsylvania, and Princeton University, and has previously worked at the United Nations and the World Bank. She holds a PhD in Public Affairs from Princeton University, a master's degree in International Development from MIT, and a bachelor's degree in Architecture from the School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi. Shahana, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be moderating what's going to be a very interesting panel discussion, especially so because when I'm DASP alumni like Radhika and Shiela, and I also did a MISTI internship more than a decade ago when I was at MIT. So we'll begin with Radhika and Shiela talking about and showing us some beautiful photographs of their experiences walking along the Betwa River. I'll ask them a few questions and then we'll talk to the other panelists. So let me just introduce both of them. Radhika Singh is, she's a master's student of urban planning at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. And she's previously worked as a correspondent for the Indian Express in Mumbai, and as well as a project manager at the research advocacy organization INHAF in Ahmedabad. She's interested in planning for sustainable development that protects the country's fragile ecology and its wealth of biodiversity. And her current research focuses on water resource management and land use planning after natural disasters. And Shahel Joshi is also a master's student of urban planning at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. He's an architect by training, and he's worked on large-scale projects for low and middle-income housing, on informal settlements, water and sanitation programs, as well as disaster management. And his interests lie at the intersection of water systems and disaster mitigation through policymaking. He's also a passionate street photographer, and his photographs have been published in the City Observer and Harvard Design Magazine. So I'll hand it over to the two of you, Shiela and Radhika.
Thank you, Shahana. Thank you, Noreen, for the introduction. I'll just quickly share my screen, and can everybody see the presentation? Okay, great. Okay, for next 5 minutes or so, I will be talking about our river walk along the Betwa River that we conducted in January 2019. This was a part of the Moving Upstream Fellowship, which was a fellowship hosted and supported by the Vedatam India Foundation and the Out of Eden Walk. The founder of Vedatam India Foundation is a part of this panel, Siddharth. To give a brief idea about where Betwa is located and where Bundelkhand is to all the attendees who might not be aware of. So that's a map of India with the two states, Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh in light pink. The darker colors indicate the region of Bundelkhand, which is kind of separated in both the states. This is a zoomed in map of all the districts of Bundelkhand, with the blue being the Betwa River. We walked at the start of the river, which was here. This is the path that we covered. We walked for around 130 kilometers, covering around 10 different villages and staying in 10 different villages on our route. Our walk started from a small town called Hamirpur, which is here, which is where the confluence of Betwa and Yamuna rivers occurs. And we walked upstream to end our walk at this point here. Our daily agenda or the method of the walk was pretty simple. We would, Hamirpur is a small town located in the state of Uttar Pradesh. So we mainly walked in the Uttar Pradesh region of Bundelkhand. Our aim was to understand the state of riparian lives in a consistently drought-prone and drought-hit region. Our daily agenda or method of conducting this research was pretty simple. You walk, meet people on the way, engage in conversations, stay with them, and you kind of repeat the same method next day. During our walk, we did not fix on a pre-decided agenda to ensure that our stories were in situ and were generated on ground. But we were curious to understand the complex network of human relationships with the river and its ecology. Even though every conversation was unique in its own right, at the end of the walk, we realized that most of conversations touched on similar interconnected themes. I'll be talking about those themes, three themes specifically for the next 5 minutes. All our conversations were directly or indirectly linked to water. While discussing about agriculture, we discussed to great extent about the low groundwater levels, inconsistent rains, and misplaced government policies. Radhika, after me, will be speaking about the water governance issues in India through our master's thesis. And after her, Siddharth will be talking about groundwater issues, Jagdish will be talking about ecology, and Olka will be talking about climate change and other issues regarding water management in India. Even though most villages we stayed in were within walking distance from the river, many farmers complained about decreasing groundwater levels. One farmer told us, and I quote, "Last season there were 2 months of rain. It washed away all the soil and left us with rock. But when we need water, it does not come. I cannot get a tube well, which is also known as a bore well, which you dig in the ground, because it will cost 5 lakh rupees, which is approximately $6,500 US. And even then, I do not know if the water will come. Sometimes after all that effort, you only get 2 inches of water. With that amount, can a farmer water his fields or just take a bath?" Like these issues with agriculture, we also discussed extensively about the roles of gender, roles of both the gender in the occupation, which seem to be intrinsically connected to the caste they belong to. Women in the lower caste households tended to work on fields out of the sheer need to survive. However, in upper caste households, specifically Brahmin families, which we ended up staying in, women tended to be confined to the home-based activities. When Radhika asked a woman in a village called Rirua why she doesn't work on fields alongside men, she gave an emphatic no. "We like working at home inside," she said. "What would we gain by being on fields? Only lower caste women have to work outside. It's a lot more work than just taking care of the house and the children." In fact, because many of the women stay at home, the task of managing water at a household level falls on them. Unfortunately, neither the state nor the policies recognize the key role of women play in water management in Bundelkhand as well as in India. Further on, while during our walk, we passed through many different activities, one of them which was affecting the ecology of the river. One of them was sand mining. Betwa is being dredged for its sand, a much needed component boosting construction projects in the urban centers. The villagers themselves are stuck in a kind of catch-22 situation. The dredging is proving to be detrimental to the water ecologies. and agriculture. But due to abysmal levels of unemployment and job opportunities in the region, they end up working at those sand mining activities as daily wage laborers. But even as one Pradhan pointed out, that this situation itself seems to be very imbalanced. 60 to 70% of the livelihood of people in this area depend on sand mining, he told us. But the nature of sand mining has changed over the last decade or so. Earlier, everyone in the village would be employed and it would fetch us around 10 to 15,000 rupees, which is approximately $130 to $200 a month. Now, however, big politically connected corporations from other states are carrying out sand mining. In fact, we understood the power structure sand mining activities incubate when we stayed at the Pradhan's house, who we suspect was clearly involved or was running a sand mining activity. Pradhan, mind you, is the political head of a village or a group cluster of small villages. Our daily conversations followed a similar pattern. We would walk till early evening, find a village to spend the night, and after exchanging some pleasantries, we would sit around a small bonfire, discuss our reasons for the walk, who we were, and where we were going. These conversations shed light on our own privilege, which we were aware of to some extent, but we realized the urban-rural disconnect in India is enormous. The need and desire to be in an urban setting was felt by us and our dear friends in the village. Our urban forms, cityscapes, development policies over decades have widened this gap. In fact, as we saw in the sand mining example, growth of India's urban centers has come at the cost of extraction of resources like water from the landscapes such as Bundelkhand. I would like to end by saying this one small quote that we used in a book that we eventually produced about the walk. The mode of walking was nothing short of revelatory. Time had never slowed down for us in this way. Used as we were to buses, trains, and cars, where experiences are momentary, places fragment into snippets of sounds, smells, and sights. By walking, we were able to fully take in our surroundings. We were able to observe closely, lean in should we need to, retrace our steps, talk to interesting passers-by. Although we had a destination in mind, the journey is what mattered. I will end here to talk further about the policies and the issues with water governance. Radhika will talk about that. So I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thanks, Shil. Yeah, as Shil mentioned, I'll be talking a little bit about our thesis, which we decided to write after this river walk. So after our river walk, we started to become very interested in trying to understand the difficulties of water management in Bundelkhand. One of the first things that we observed during our research was that Bundelkhand has received a lot of attention by the government, stretching as far back as the 1980s. Droughts, although they are now increasing in frequency, have been an issue for a long time. There have been many reports by think tanks and research organizations, including TERI, Niti Aayog, and the UNDP, that have been published over the years. However, even with all of this attention and expertise focused on Bundelkhand, there has been little change on the ground. A lot of resources have also been directed towards the region. The Bundelkhand package by the central government, for instance, distributed 7,500 crores, which is around $1 million, to the states of MP and UP. However, again, little was achieved with this money. So what we were trying to understand was why? What is the reason behind ineffective water governance and implementation at all levels of the government, from the center to the village level? So what I'm going to do over the next few minutes is just quickly go over our main findings. The first thing that we found was that governance was way too centralized. All of the resources and directives towards Bundelkhand flowed from the central government, which is in charge of disaster response. Local level institutions were really only in charge of implementation rather than having any sort of contribution towards planning. At the same time, governance was also extremely fragmented. In order for the central government to try and manage water and water-related disasters from across the country, it had to create hundreds of different agencies to deal with the various issues. These agencies weren't streamlined or coordinated, and it was simply too much for the central government to handle. The third thing that we found was that there's a tendency towards crisis response rather than long-term planning, because governments prefer responding to a crisis rather than try to prevent it. Plans are also drawn up for immediate relief for drought. Projects are implemented haphazardly and without the engagement and input of people, and outputs often suffer from a lack of maintenance, monitoring, or evaluation. More generally, the unclear mandates, lack of accountability, and general paucity of government capacity hamper government efforts at all levels. So given this ineffectiveness and absence of government, you can see strong feudal relations in Bundelkhand continue to undergird caste, class, and gender hierarchies at the local level. And this makes local level planning extremely difficult. So we believe that these problems necessitated a change in governance structures and roles through all levels of government. However, we've tried not to be confined by the dichotomy of top-down versus bottom-up governance. We think that the central, state, and local level governments are all essential to managing the water crisis, and their functions must be molded according to each level's ability and the particular circumstances of the issue. So now I'll just quickly go over our recommendations. And our recommendations outline the ways in which the different levels of government can work together. And we also suggest possible checks and balances that would increase accountability. So the reforms we recommend included decentralization, a move towards long-term watershed planning, a pragmatic take on incentive and pressure-based planning. And we also look at the ways government personnel and civil society can build their capacity in terms of expertise, resources, and funds. So I'll just give a couple of specific recommendations. For instance, at the state level, bringing together the different agencies at the state level would be a good step forward. Right now, they're still extremely fragmented. Irrigation, drinking water, sanitation, water resource management, and drought response are all handled by different agencies, each of them have their own plans for surface and groundwater usage. This has resulted in overlapping mandates, inefficiency, and mismanagement. Another recommendation that we wrote up was limiting the role of the district collector. So currently, he or she has to deal with problems ranging from resolving family disputes to implementing development programs which have districts for up to 2 million people in Bundelkhand. This is an impossible task. We believe that at least in water management, the role of the district collector should be limited to data gathering and dissemination, the communication of important policies or schemes, monitoring and evaluation, facilitating coordination, and of course, emergency response. At the block level, we found that it was extremely essential that capacity be improved. And we recommended that each block in Bundelkhand, which is made up of between 100 to 150 village, recruits permanent employees that focus on water management. And these employees could work with local NGOs in the area. And finally, just to wrap up, the particular nature of drought is interesting and warrants its own response that is often different from other disasters. So drought is creeping, which means that it's much more difficult to ascertain a start or end date. So that's why measures to mitigate water scarcity should be an integral part of future water policies and not just on the policies of disaster management. Yeah, I think that's it. That's just basically a summary of our thesis and our main findings. And over now to Shahana.
Thank you so much, Shiela and Radhika. That was extremely interesting. And it kind of also shows the very complex challenges of actually implementing and getting things done. So as you pointed out, there've been a lot of development efforts with all levels of the state involved, but they haven't really yielded much. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about, since you're suggesting that there should definitely be more of a role for local people, in your conversations with them, what has been their perception of all these years of development efforts, and how do you think they might have approached some of these issues, drought and sand mining, differently if they had, say, more of a say? Were you able to talk about some of these things? Like what would change, for instance, with more local input? And both of you can answer. Thank you. Whoever goes first.
I'll just speak quickly on what I think, and then Shiela, feel free to add anything. So I think that when we were on our river walk, one thing that we really noticed was just the absence of government. There were very few government personnel. In order to speak to any government personnel, it would be very difficult for villagers and take a lot of time, requires a lot of time and effort. At the same time, we also became very aware of the fact that where there was government, they were often tied into like patronage and client networks with higher caste villagers or higher class villagers. And programs and schemes were often directed towards privileging them and benefiting them at the expense of other more vulnerable populations. So I think what is now happening is that there is input from the local level, but I think it has been confined mainly to the elites at the local level and not as much everyone else. So I think that greater steps towards that and creating spaces for that to happen would definitely help towards improving the situation. Shiela?
Yeah, you I think covered pretty much everything. With respect to local level, one other thing small point I would like to add is that the small part of the river that we walked for 2 weeks, there was a lot of misinformation, and that's not necessary to the villages. We also experienced that in urban centers. There was misinformation, but there was also lack of information. For example, there is a river linking project between the Ken and the Betwa river. Just like many other river linking projects the Indian government has proposed, it proposes to transfer water from the Ken river to the Betwa river. While talking to one of the villagers in a village called Dohal, we asked him about this particular project or what his views are. He essentially said that this is a good thing. When we asked him about why do you think it's good or beneficial, he was like, oh, it'll help to transfer water and we'll get more water. When we asked him about, for example, when you make a canal to connect those rivers, land need to be acquired. There'll be some land acquisition that coming in play, and there'll be some people getting affected because of that. To which his reply was, it's inevitable. And I think that was very telling of the fact that the information and in a way the kind of propaganda the government uses to talk about these things is widespread through these large projects, large engineering industrial projects, even dams, which is becoming detrimental. However, in the so-called common psyche, many people thought those were the good, beneficial things. So yeah, I would also, I guess, Shana, can I take a question from the
Sure.
Q&A?
Yeah.
I think as it relates to that. So thanks, Aarti, for asking that question. Regarding the rainwater harvesting systems, we did study that in our thesis. So during, and I'm going pretty way back, I'm going almost in the 9th to the 13th century and the 16th century, when the Chandela and the Bundela kings were ruling the region of Bundelkhand, and also Bundela is where the name comes from. They had invested a lot of resources in water conservation infrastructures. So from construction of tanks to ponds to wells. Unfortunately, because our typical approach of the bureaucracy is towards these large-scale engineering projects, the so-called modern projects, a lot of these infrastructures are kind of in a derelict or a defunct state at this point. So there have been studies by a lot of experts. I think one of them is Shrija Nair. She works at the National Institute of Disaster Management. They have come up with studies that if and when these structures are revived, they will help to, in a way, localize the water management issue and also solve many of the problems which are viewed as a much larger issue, but they can be solved locally through participatory planning, through the involvement of local people. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Shiela and Radhika. That was very insightful. Our next speaker, Siddharth, actually will be able to delve deeper into some of the questions that are coming up and what you've begun with, which is things like local water management techniques and other ways of resolving water scarcity in these areas. So let me introduce our next speaker, Siddharth Agarwal, who is he's an author and he's the founder of Vedatam, who I believe organized the river walk. And Vedatam India Foundation is an organization that's based in Kolkata that works at the intersection of environment, culture, and society. And using innovative methods such as ground level research, documentation, and the use of media tools, they work to tell stories of Indian environment and people. And the intent is to amplify these stories and to involve young Indians in the process so that we're all able to push for collective action. Siddharth, I hand over to you.
Thanks, Shahana, and thanks, Shiela and Radhika, for that nice introduction to the current water situation in Bundelkhand. I have a few pictures that I've put together to share some of these stories or some of these aspects that we've seen mentioned. Others, Dr. Krishnaswamy and Ulka, they will be talking about more issues. I'll try and keep it around the idea of agriculture and environment in the region. Very quickly, Vedatam as an organization has been trying to understand rivers for a few years in India now. And as part of our work, we've also walked along the river Ganga and also along the river Ken. And while walking along the river Ken, the Betwa itself came up as a natural, next river that we wanted to walk along and document. And between this walking along the river Ken and the Betwa fellowship happening, I was walking with Paul Salopek from the Out of Eden Walk. And what ended up happening was that we together put together this fellowship called Moving Upstream Betwa, and for which we sent out put out a call for applications, and that's when Radhika and Shiela also applied, and they became part of this larger family of people who have been walking in India and documenting the country at from the grassroots at booth level. And this is how the overall fellowship looked like. You can see the river starting the source. You can see at the bottom flows north to the Yamuna. This region near Hamirpur is where Shiela and Radhika spend their time. And this region, this is the area of Bundelkhand, as has already been mentioned. There's huge discussion about water scarcity. But what leads to this? Because people have inhabited this region for a very long time. They continue to inhabit this region. But in recent times, what has happened is there's been intensive cropping. What you can see in this picture, and I don't want this to appear as a singular template for all of Bundelkhand, but even in parts of Bundelkhand where, for example, like Shiela mentioned, the river linking project, which is supposed to benefit. So these regions are already growing high water intensity crops like paddy in these regions, and wheat. Wheat itself is very water intensive as compared to the amount of water that Bundelkhand has. And that is one of the reasons which is leading to a lot of stress. And it's not something that's naturally come to a lot of people, but it's been pushed a lot by market forces which dictate what farmers grow, because that's what's collected by the government. That's what the minimum support price is given for. And when this happens, when this cropping happens at this intensity, what you can see here on the horizon, just before the horizon, is the Ken River, which is close to the Betwa. You can see that the land is farmed till the edge of the river, and the forests have been taken over. And this is not just an issue in this region, this is an issue across the world and across India. And this reduction in forests, this reduction in the quality of the catchment area of a river contributes towards this reduction in water availability, especially if you're talking about a river. With this combination of intensive cropping and the reduction in forests, there is a need for water which is not available locally on the surface. So how does that come to these fields is by damming a river and making canals, which you can see on the left, or through groundwater, which is the right hand side. What you can see is the pump house where water is continuously extracted from the ground and used for irrigation. And in an area that is stressed for water, we have already redrawn the geography by making these canals, by damming our rivers, by diverting flow, and also extracting a lot of the groundwater, which essentially, if you look at it at a very village level, is a sort of a shared resource. And when that shared resource gets stressed because of over extraction, what results is a problem of access and contamination that comes up. And this problem of access and contamination is further accentuated by issues like what Shiela had mentioned earlier regarding caste and gender, that the control of access is in very few hands, especially the caste hierarchy, which controls access to resources. And this whole chain of events, from very intensive cropping, which is pushed by market forces, which leads us to ask for resources that are typically not available locally, and that is brought in from far away places. And the local resources, when get depleted, the most marginalized are the people who are really getting affected. And this whole series of events has to be seen, I think, together, and then fed into the idea of governance. And just to mention that this question of rainwater harvesting that came up, and local techniques, apart from the bundelas and the chandelas and the systems that they had made, even contemporary farmers like Prem Singh from Banda and Pushpendra Bhai from Banda have actually succeeded in creating a local model of agriculture, which they call avartansheel kheti, or sustainable farming, in which they're trying to get the farmer to de-link himself or de-link herself from the market, and ensure that the market comes to their doorstep instead of them going to the market, which seems to be working, and also works on a very small plot level design, which I don't want to go into in detail right now, but definitely something that I can share more about, which takes care of stopping the rainwater where it's falling, letting it percolate into the ground, growing growing different kinds of, doing multi-cropping, and also doing agroforestry. So it's a mix that really works for the region. And with this continuous reduction in groundwater, what's also reduced, and this is something that as a concept most of us don't engage with, or outside the group of people who we are, probably a lot of people don't even understand the fact that reduced base flows, which is the groundwater, what it feeds to the river, means that the river also reduces in volume and reduces in strength. And that is something that I think Dr. Krishnaswamy, in his talk about ecology and the ecological aspect of rivers, will probably take up. So I'll let that pass on to him, and I'll stop here and just, yeah. Shahana, you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was really fascinating, especially what you were talking about, these, say, new solutions or ways in which some farmers have been able to organize or revive traditional ways. And I wonder if you could delve a little bit more into this idea of making the market come to, so it doesn't seem so much about delinking from the market, but because I used to be very much a statist, but I think given the history of failures and the particular ways in which the state works, and then we also see that purely local solutions can't work either, in that they also, given caste issues, given gender issues, when we think of governance, we really need to think of how these different systems can work together. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, delve a little bit more into this approach that these farmers have taken, and also whether these have scaled up and what potential they have for being a larger solution.
Right, thanks for that. What's interesting is that this experimental solution that has been tried in Bundelkhand by this group of farmers in Banda district of Uttar Pradesh, which is within Bundelkhand. They started a few years ago, almost a decade ago, and have been trying to, through their success, because that's what drives others also to take up something. Through their success, they've been trying to push or inspire other farmers in the region. And basically what they do is divide their plot of land into 3 parts, leave 1/3 of the plot to conserve water, have 1/3 of the plot growing crops, and which is also multi-cropping, and the rest 1/3 of the plot for growing vegetables, growing fruits, planting trees. And this small ecosystem is what they propose that others also take up and do in their own spaces. From their attempts over the years in the past decade, from their one pond, and through interventions via the government, they've approached the state governments, they approached railways on how this can happen. They've successfully managed to help dig over, I think, close to 10,000 ponds in Bundelkhand. So it has scale, and the farmers who've actually taken this up have benefited from this, now have more water security. And one of the proposals within this is that the farmer should first take care of the family, and then the farmer, she or he, tries to sell it to the market and also take control of some amount of the processing of food, which is where the markup really happens. So yeah, I think that's the, I would say that it's a model worth studying. I will, in the chat box here, leave a link to a TEDx talk by Prem Singh, who's talked about this in detail, and so that we can move on with the discussion here. Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much, Siddharth. This has been fascinating, but we're running a little short on time, so I'll move on to Jagdish, who's really going to now help us put some of this into the larger context of river ecology and river ecosystems, and talk a little bit about how these approaches might affect river ecosystems as opposed to, say, the kind of centralized interlinking rivers. And I'll give a very brief intro. Jagdish Krishnasamy is a senior fellow at ATRE at the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment. He has a PhD in environmental studies as well as an engineering degree from IIT and a PhD from Duke. And he's worked extensively on climate change and climate science in India, Central America, and Africa. And he's the coordinating lead author of the special IPCC report on climate change, desertification, degradation, sustainable land management, food security, and greenhouse gas fluxes in terrestrial ecosystems. So Jagdish, over to you on the river ecosystems.
Chana, I'm going to share my, so I hope everybody can see this. And can everybody hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So just spend a little time setting the context, and we heard the really enriching experience of Shiela and Radhika along the Betwa. We also heard from Siddharth about the water governance and other aspects in the region. And then now I'm going to just set the context for some of the discussions that apply to the ecology aspects. So just a very nice schematic made by Megha Vishwanath, which shows a river as it flows all the way from the mountains and hills all the way to the sea. And as we can see, wherever the water is going along with the sediment and nutrients, it's creating ecosystems and habitats, not just for biodiversity and fisheries, but also for people and sustaining a lot of livelihoods, including the in the mangroves and in the estuaries and deltas and even in the near coastal waters. So the influence of a river and all that it does as it goes from the hills and mountains to the sea is all about in some sense flowing water. So this whole notion that there is a lot of useless surplus water in one basin is something that can easily be challenged if you actually look at what this flowing water along with the sediment is able to do all along its pathway. And sediment is a very big part of the ecology of rivers. So it's habitats like this, river islands and sandbars, they are critical for sustaining the ecology of rivers. Apart from providing nesting habitat and basking habitats for many species, especially species such as the gharial crocodile or freshwater turtles and otters and so on. The sand itself plays a very important role in filtering water quality. It also, the sand at the bottom of a river is essential for the breeding of many species of fish. So sand is an integral part of the river ecosystem. And this is just an example of how species use these sand deposits. This is a smooth-coated otter in the Vikram Shiela Dolphin Sanctuary in Bihar. I took this picture many years ago when I was working with Nachiket in the field. These are gharial crocodiles in the Chambal, and the Cane River, from which we are going to be through river linking, if it happens, going to be taking water and putting it into the Betwa. The cane actually has a remnant population of reintroduced gharials, and so it was originally set up as one of the sites where the gharials would be able to breed. So that's been happening over many decades, and clearly, that's something that's going to get compromised a lot. And these are the types of habitats that are sustained. All of these are examples from different rivers in the country that I have been had the privilege to visit or work in, and they are all these riparian forests. As you can see, they depend on the type of sediments that are deposited, the vegetation that is sustained along the banks. They provide a lot of ecosystem services to many people who depend on them, apart from the wonderful biodiversity that they support. Now, finally, this so-called useless surplus water and the sediment it carries, it reaches our estuaries, deltas, and the seas. And here is a picture showing chlorophyll A concentration. And you can see that wherever there's a river mouth in the Bay of Bengal, you have a hot spot of productivity. And river linking, if it's implemented at the scale at which it is envisaged, is being shown to be reducing the amount of sediment reaching some of our most important deltas and estuaries, which would really have a big impact on the productivity of our coastal and near coastal fisheries. Another thing about this so-called surplus and deficient basin issue is that rainfall patterns have been changing, trends are emerging. So this is a schematic showing the trends in rainfall. So the more red you get, the more negative the trends are, from 1948 to 2012 or so. And then, so the Indian monsoon has been in some form of decline since the 1950s, and many of our climate models are not able to capture that, and now people are making attempts to improve the models and to simulate these historical trends. But this just to illustrate that we are likely to see major changes in shifts in rainfall in the coming decades, and there's a lot of uncertainty associated with that. So to carve in stone that one basin is surplus and another one is deficient, even if you buy that argument, these are completely non-stationary processes, and we are likely to see major shifts in the moisture that's coming to these basins. Of course, I already said that the so-called surplus water shouldn't be called surplus, but it actually performs a lot of useful functions. So interlinking of rivers is going to be having major impacts in terms of course, impacts on land acquisition, ripping through lots of forests, about 1,100 kilometers of estimate. This is just a conservative estimate of how it will be passing through important forest areas as well. And also just to point out that apart from the huge scale transformation, each of our rivers is very unique in terms of the geology from which it emerges, the biogeography, and the many species that exist are very unique to some of the river systems. And also some of our rivers are more polluted, others are less polluted. And when we're talking about interlinking all of them in a particular manner, you can imagine that we're going to be exporting invasive species of fish from one basin to another, polluted water from one basin to another, mixing up the biogeographics which have evolved over millions of years, and completely transforming the ecology in many other ways. And we as a country have made a commitment to climate change mitigation, and our remaining forests, our remnant forests, are an integral part of this. And this is the riverine forest in the Panna Tiger Reserve. which is one of the finest examples of forest left in that region. And this is what will happen to it when the river linking project is implemented. So we're going to be sacrificing lakhs of trees which are already sequestering carbon, so the cost is just enormous. So that is one thing. And the other I think I wanted to end with is that we are exporting water from one basin to another virtually. When you grow a water-intensive crop like sugarcane or rice in one basin, and that is consumed by people in another basin, we are actually exporting water through that crop. So it's already happening in other ways. So now this physical transformation of taking water from one basin to another, with all the costs that it involves, is something that we really need to be questioning compared to other forms of of water governance. And let's also remember that biomes all across the world, they have very different moisture regimes. And nobody, I think, would be suggesting that we need to have equal amount of water in all the biomes around the world. They all have evolved with certain types of climates. And of course, you need enough water for sanitation, for drinking water, and for the well-being of people who live in that basin, and also for sustainable agriculture. But whether river linking is the answer to that is something that we have to think about. And so I'm just going to end here. And Shana, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jagdish. I mean, this was it was illuminating and also disturbing in many ways. One thing that I sometimes take heart from is that the general record on large projects of the Indian states don't usually come through, and that might be a feature, not a bug. But what I wanted to ask you is that Radhika and Shiela and a lot of people have brought up the issues of over-centralization, fragmentation, but it seems that for the state to really govern in a way that takes ecology into consideration, that actually is able to mitigate and address the climate crisis, we need a much more foundational transformation in how state institutions approach water governance. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. Like in an ideal situation, how would such a river basin and river basins in general be governed?
Yeah, so, most of our water governance and policies have been very top-down. And they also are many supply oriented, and there's not enough of demand management. We know that. If you look at any river basin, there's going to be of eventually part of that basin. You use water up to a certain amount in a particular part of the catchment, and you also then need to allow some of that water to sustain the areas which are downstream. So that would be, when you're talking about, so you have an obligation, people who are living upstream of other sets of communities, in some sense, you have an obligation for using water sustainably and then passing on, ensuring that the flows, whether it's through groundwater or whether it's through surface water, they can benefit people downstream. Now, when you have a top-down approach to water governance, this is the linkage that gets this communication between scales. Because when you're talking about a watershed upstream and then a watershed downstream, you need to have communication. You need to have understanding of the water requirements in both the areas, and you need these people and communities to interact. And then so this is how you would be scaling up. And so by the time, let's say, the Betwa joins the Jamuna, you would have, ideally, in an ideal world, through this decentralized water governance and sharing water between humans and nature. And let's also just remember that when we share water with nature, that it's not as if that it's not also benefiting us indirectly. So whatever water we share with nature actually sustain many ecosystem services as well. So it's not like a separate compartment either. So by the time the river reaches and joins another major river, you would have ensured that that decentralized water governance has done that negotiated share of limited water resources, and also choices about things like what type of crops can be grown. And we know the nutrition content of many crops in the country, and you will be surprised to hear, I think many folks will be surprised to hear that even in semi-arid parts of the country, we have dammed rivers in parts of Maharashtra to grow sugarcane, which is a water-intensive crop. It is definitely not a big contributor to our food security. And so when we talk about water shortages and so on, these are some of the things, the elephants in the room that we are not questioning. And this will have to come into play from watershed to watershed, from village to village, ensuring that water is equitably shared between people, communities, human communities, but also with nature and the river. So I think I'm going to end there because I'm sure that others have a lot to contribute in this regard.
Thank you, Jagdish. Ulka is now going to, Jagdish started talking about the issues of climate stress, and Ulka is really also going to talk about why it's so necessary to make some of these really transformative changes in the way we govern water and use water resources in India, and link it to the larger climate crisis. Ulka, over to you.
Thank you, Shahana, and thank you very much to MIT for for inviting me to speak in the session. First of all, let me start by complimenting Radhika and Shel. I think I've been so impressed by the stories that I've been reading, the very sensitive and open approach that you took to this walk, just to understand what kinds of problems, what is the current context. I think that has to be the starting point of any sensible policy making. So congratulations on that. And I really liked your closing line of your blog where you said that anybody with a bit of curiosity and the ability to take a few days off, just walk and understand what is going on. So congratulations on the virtual exhibition as well, which will I think happen at the end of this session. I'm really looking forward to it. What I'm going to do is just share my screen. And one of the interesting things that I wanted to say was that, the things that you saw on your walk and the things that, Siddharth sees on his walks and Jagdish has studied, this is actually something that is actually hiding in plain sight. One of my colleagues who looks at Google Maps a lot finds these kinds of images appearing from time to time, where Google Maps seems to show roads appearing in the middle of a river. Right? And these are not roads, but what this is the tracks of sand mining lorries, because which go over and over on the same tracks, and it shows up, in fact, in satellite images. So I think the work that you're all doing at Vedatam and through this MIT fellowship is making this very transparently, understandable by urban audiences, who may never have seen these kinds of sites with their own eyes. But what is the demand for sand mining coming from? It's coming from having to build our cities, from having to build our infrastructure. So there is a very direct link between what we see in our cities and what is hidden from us. So, so with that kind of context, I'm going to speak about three things. One is that we need to prepare not just for current risks, but also for future risks. Second, the problems that we analyze, right, especially in the climate change context, even though we may be trying to understand them by walking along one river or the stretch of a river, the problems may lie elsewhere, and so may the solutions. So what we need is systems thinking. And the third thing that I'm going to speak about is that the solutions that we propose may have inadvertent consequences, or what we call maladaptation. And the only way to try to avoid this is by involving all the affected actors and stakeholders and having greater participation of local communities. So with this background, let me just talk about the first issue, which is, what do we really know about how climate change will affect the monsoon rainfall in India? And it turns out that we actually know very little. We don't know much for sure. We don't know if rainfall will increase or rainfall will decrease. It is really as complicated as that. But what we do know is that rainfall will become more erratic, more uncertain. And there have been a number of studies, global models, regional models, and the latest report from the Ministry of Earth Sciences, which just came out last month, shows both observed data as well as projected model data, which shows that the variability of rainfall has increased. Extreme rainfall days have increased drastically. Dry spells have increased. And what is likely to happen in the future is that the frequency of drought, the intensity of drought, and the area of drought is going to increase. And this is especially well understood for central India, which is a kind of homogeneous sort of landmass. You know, things are more difficult when you get towards the Himalayas, but for the center of India, we know these things reasonably well. In a country like ours, climate change actually comes on top of a lot of stresses. So what we saw, in fact, during the recent COVID pandemic was a convergence of multiple crises. I think you would have all seen in the news about this swarm of locusts that descended upon us all the way up to Mumbai and Madhya Pradesh as well. And typically these originate in Africa and travel across the Middle East, across Afghanistan and Pakistan, and they reach Rajasthan every year. And what usually happens is that there is surveillance and there is some kind of pesticide-based control of these locust swarms. But this year, because of the pandemic, that couldn't happen. The surveillance didn't happen and the pesticide spraying didn't happen. And there was another climatic factor over there, which is that because last year's rains were so prolonged and the monsoon was slow to depart, there were a lot of very fertile, moisture-rich conditions in India, which attracted these locust swarms and allowed them to breed. So this is how climate change can exacerbate existing risks on top of other things. So with that, I'm going to just have one slide in my entire presentation. And this is from a dashboard that WRI maintains called the PREP dashboard, you know, the sort of sources over there. And this particular map shows a specific component of monsoon rain, which is post-monsoon rainfall, how it is projected to change. Under a fairly optimistic scenario, this is not an extreme scenario of climate change. And it is just showing how over the next 30 years, compared to the baseline, what is likely to be the change in post-monsoon rainfall. And as you can see for the Betwa basin over here, as well as the Cane basin, for much of Madhya Pradesh, you can see that there is likely to be a decrease in post-monsoon rainfall. Now, why is this important? This is important, as you know, the previous speakers have said, that this is a drought-prone region already, and the ground is hard, recharge is not easy, and you're growing wheat. And for wheat cultivation, post-monsoon rainfall is actually very important. So it's important for soil moisture, it's important for groundwater recharge. So what has happened over the last few decades is we have shifted away from millets to wheat in this area. And you have future risks, which are, you know, hard to believe, but are going to be even worse than current risks. So, so this brings me to my second point, which is that of the kinds of solutions, right? As Siddharth has spoken about, if we are growing water-intensive crops, what needs to change is not something that the community can control, that the farmers can influence, but support prices need to change for the crops, for the right kind of crops, and market connectivity and demand needs to be created. The second aspect of this is interlinking, and solutions like that will not help, because in years with good rainfall, all the rivers, Betwa and Cane, will have rainfall. And in years which have poor rainfall, you know, the solution may not work. So you need the kinds of restoration of the river ecology, check dams, recharge ponds, integrated watershed management. And in fact, this is something that in the climate change circles is really getting more and more emphasis now as what are being called nature-based solutions. We usually, when we hear this word, we usually think that they're talking about tree planting, but it's much more than that. All of this, you know, comes in the purview of nature-based solutions. There is growing climate finance being pledged for nature-based solutions by different countries, and this is really something that we need to explore. The third aspect of this is, you know, when we talk about sand mining, this is influencing the sort of creating problems in terms of groundwater recharge as well as flooding. And what it is telling us is that surface water and groundwater are linked. And this is something that Atri's research from other river basins has also shown. So these problems are linked, but the institutions are not linked. And here again, I'm optimistic in the sense that the Madhya Pradesh government in particular, in its state action plan on climate change, has tried to have an approach of mainstreaming climate risks into existing departmental budgets and existing departmental programs. And one example, admittedly, it was a relatively simpler example, was that in the animal husbandry department, where they tried to actually promote drought-tolerant, hardy, traditional varieties, traditional breeds of cattle, and promote them through finance and through providing assistance to farmers. So this is an approach that we are working on more and more, and trying to say that yes, we know departments are not linked, we know budgets are limited, but there is a way in which you can mainstream climate change into your existing programs and existing ways of functioning. And the third point, and the third and the last point that I really want to talk about is who is affected. And here, I think I was really most touched by the stories that Radhika and Shiela have written. My fieldwork has been in a very similar terrain in Marathwada, in the district of Jalna, which is a very similar kind of social structure, similar issues really. And it's always the Dalit habitation where the open well, which is built in sort of poor soils, is the first to dry up. And it's always a Dalit habitation where the water tanker is the last to visit, when tankers are arranged by the government. And the kind of caste-based solidarity networks that we see upper caste communities able to make use of are not available to lower caste communities. Women as well. I was really struck by one statistic from a village which had a sex ratio of 783 women per 1,000 men. The stories that they've written says that we thought we weren't seeing women because they were inside their homes busy working, but actually there are parts of our country where the sex ratio is really like that. The women are invisible in more ways than one. And of course, their labor, whether it is in the farm or whether it is in the household, is unpaid labor. So this kind of inequity of access and inequity of access to resources as well as to decision-making circles creates a kind of differential vulnerability, which has been studied extensively in the climate change literature. But the point is, when we devise adaptation solutions, we need to take into account how do these adaptation interventions that we are recommending, how do they affect women's work burden? And there have been a number of cases, whether it is improved cook stoves, or in the dairy farming industry, or whether it is in, say, vermicomposting solutions in farming. It's always that the work burden falls on women. And so the kind of implementation that you think will happen, unless you train women, unless you take into account whether that increases their time and work burden, that will not happen. So in terms of solutions, there is no easy solution. We need to have more participation, more consultation, especially through NGOs, citizen groups. And as Shahana said, community-based adaptation, which was really quite a buzzword in climate change, has its severe limitations, especially when you have extreme drought and years of consecutive drought. So even things like insurance and disaster risk management solutions from the finance industry really fail when it comes to extensive climate disasters. So we need crop support prices to change. We need sand mining to be regulated, watershed development to be subsidized. We need other livelihoods to be supported. All this has to happen through greater government support, but in a way that local communities are also consulted. And there are positive examples, their climate action plans from the national level to the local level. And the local adaptation plans of action were made through extensive consultations at the district, block, and village levels. So let me just stop with that, and be happy to discuss more and take questions as well. Thank you, Shannon.
Ulka, this has really been a wonderful presentation because we moved from the very grounded experiences of Shiela and Radhika speaking to people in the village to Ulka, who's really highlighted the connection with kind of larger economic development patterns, urbanization, the kind of continuing issues of caste and gender. Also, you've talked about some positive things. And just to end a little more with that, and I'm going to connect to one of the questions that one of the participants asked. So we are reaching the end of time, but we're going to extend this a little bit longer so we can take some of the participants' questions. But I'll talk about a related one, which was really about what are the, what would have motivated these changes, say, in Madhya Pradesh? And they were asking about what, I mean, could basic ecological concerns, including water, and water has been a politically salient issue, certainly in cities. Can it be an important part of political parties' agendas? Has it been? And what role will larger public awareness and mobilization and education play in pushing forward some of the shifts we want to more responsive and more ecologically sensible and sustainable patterns of water governance and development? So this question is for Ulka, and then we'll have open it up, and I'll address ask others some of the questions that we have in the chat box.
Thanks, Shanna. I'm sure there are better answers from from other speakers in this panel. But on the political party's agenda, I thought I could honestly say that the animal husbandry example that I gave of mainstreaming climate concerns into decision making was really driven, was really helped by the government's support for this particular agenda involving cattle, and to make sure that there was a certain pride in bringing back traditional varieties, traditional breeds. So I think in some cases there is a happy coincidence, there is a kind of support. But right now, I think what would be really sort of driving the political agenda is the issue of jobs and livelihoods and migrant workers. If we can find a way to really bring these various issues together and show how the solutions for one set of problems is also a good solution for others, I think that is really up to us to try to communicate. In terms of the role of public participation, I mean, I don't have very easy solutions over here, except that that we really need stronger civic agencies, and I think Siddharth and others might want to speak to this a little more. That I think there are examples from other parts of the country. For example, the People Science Institute in the Hills, which has done exemplary work. But I'm sure there are others as well, which we can learn from and draw on. Perhaps Hannah, you want to pose this question?
So yes, I'm going to pose this to others. Siddharth, definitely, Jagdish, Shell, and Radhika also, what you saw on the ground, because it's a really important one, right? It would be the source of the sort of transformations we need. And I'm just going to add in one question because it's actually related. So Deepak Singh had asked, what is the reason to centralize the rivers and what are the perceived benefits? So in some way, whatever solutions we propose should be able to speak to these perceived benefits that policymakers think will emerge from this interlinking. So does Siddharth, do you want to speak about?
I'll quickly just pick up from where Ulka left, talking about political will and the actions that follow. I think one of the key elements that we constantly miss is the kind of economic system that we are living inside, and the political system, which is the current neoliberal neo-capital system, and which pushes for intensive and large-scale solutions of the kind of that we're discussing, like river interlinking. And unless that chain is broken, unless there is a transformation in mindset in terms of what kind of a political and economic system we are living in, I think it will not be able to push any of our political parties in a long run towards taking action which keeps in mind these various small aspects, which includes the migrant workers, which includes the resource deficiency that some places have, and we'll constantly keep trying to sort of make everything uniform. So I think that also has to come as a radical transformation of people's ideas in the political and economic system. And I think probably Dr. Krishnaswamy may be able to answer the question regarding centralized rivers better. So I'll ask him to answer.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is that if we look at the discourse on rivers in different in the manifestos of some parties, and so we have seen clearly that, for example, the Ganga played a very major role. The revival of the Ganga was a commitment that a particular party made, and the government has been very active on certain aspects of it. And yet, even in that, we found that whenever there was a contradiction in terms of, for example, maintaining the flows in the river, keeping the sediment going, the impact of converting the Ganga into a waterway and dredging the sand out of it and converting it into a navigable canal, the contradictions between a commitment to the river, okay, reducing pollution is one aspect, but to revive the Ganga as a living ecosystem all the way from the mountains to the delta requires understanding and a commitment to keeping all those basic processes going. And we found that whenever push came to shove, there was always pushback on the ecological side or on other aspects. If you take the example of the Yamuna, so for example, the party in power in Delhi has made a commitment to reviving the Yamuna, and I know that we all know that the Yamuna in Delhi is one of the most difficult rivers to revive and restore. It requires drastic transformations, which also includes the flow from upstream, and also the role that Delhi as a city plays in generating wastewater, how it consumes water and what does it do with that water. So all of that is connected. So increasingly urban, peri-urban and rural and forested, all of these dimensions of managing a river basin and a river ecosystem, it doesn't lend itself to a very top-down approach actually, because we have found from our study of watershed management in the past that we had a very big commitment to watershed, integrated watershed management all over the country. And just like the Green Revolution was for irrigated agriculture, the watershed development initiative was targeted towards more rain-fed and more drier areas. And whenever water was saved through whatever means, local water conservation measures and so on, if you didn't have a governance plan for what you're going to do with that extra water, people found new uses for that water. It never went back, in many cases, it never went back into the ground or into the nearest river. So you can save water in one sector, but you also need to then save that that first charge on the saved water is going to be the river, or it's going to be reviving our groundwater resources and the ecology of the river. So unless that linkage is made, which can only happen at local to regional scales, anything that looks upon the entire river system as a single entity, as pipes to be connected and as a huge water resource to be managed, is likely to create a lot of trade-offs with different uses of the water, different ecosystem services. And those trade-offs and synergies between different ecosystem services and how we share water between human needs and the needs of nature, I think are best resolved at a much more local to regional scale. And I think that is definitely not happening as part of our overall water policy. And in answer to a question about why rivers are being nationalized or whatever, so there are issues of sharing water, river water between states, and there are tribunals which have been set up to manage that. So I think there is a view that many of these tribunals have not been able to resolve these problems and so on, and therefore all these problems, whether it's between Goa and Karnataka on the Malaprabha and Mandovi, or whether it's between Tamil Nadu and Karnataka on the Kaveri, or between many other states, these are best resolved by some sort of a top-down arrangement that would reduce these types of delays and confusion created by these tribunals which are not able to function adequately. There's one view that's how it's coming from. But if you want to really achieve sustainable water management and sharing of water between human communities and nature, with water justice and environmental justice at the core of it, you will certainly have to do it at a much more decentralized scale.
Thank you so much, Jagdish. And just to end, I'm going to go back, since we're going back now to the local, to Shail and Radhika. And what did you see there? What were the local political concerns? Did people care about water? Was there any mobilization? How did younger people see their future in that? What sort of sources and potential did you see for something of a more kind of ground level social or political mobilization from the people there to kind of take more control over or participate more in managing their own environment?
Mm-hmm. So I have a couple of observations which also tie back into water becoming a more salient political issue. The first one, which Ulka mentioned briefly, was the issue of migration. So in a lot of villages that we came across in Bundelkhand, up to 50% of the people had migrated to cities in search for work. So this is a huge issue in the region and has been driven in a lot of cases by the fact that agriculture is not feasible livelihood anymore. So that may be an issue which is able to bring water and water scarcity to the political arena. And the second thing that I thought of in response to that question was that over the last couple of decades, there have been various groups actually fighting for a separate state of Bundelkhand. And some of the reasons that they have asked for this separate state instead of being separated between MP and UP is that they believe that there's a lot of corruption related to schemes and plans in Bundelkhand, political and economic neglect by the parent state, and the lack of governance in the region. However, what was really interesting for us when looking at these separatist movements was that there was almost no explicit mention of water and water scarcity being the reason for needing a separate state. It was framed definitely, yes, in economic terms, but water wasn't an explicit part of that conversation a lot of the time. So I think that would be an interesting opportunity perhaps to move forward with some of these movements and their demands. Shiela?
I'd like to kind of connect to the point Jagdish was making regarding tribunals and the interstate so-called fights for water and water management. One of the things that we came across, this is not particularly on our ground, but also through our research, was that, for example, the National Water Policy of India of 2012, which is the latest one, and now it's again being kind of modified, has adopted an approach of the river basin organizations. If you look at, which basically means that the organization and the management of river should happen at a basin level. But water in India is a state subject. Basins flow across multiple states. There is a conflict there itself in the way the policy is written. One other thing that came about was that we keep hearing this integrated resource water management, IWRM. This concept came about in the 90s in the international sector that kind of percolated in the 2005s when the Disaster Management Act was made in India. Unfortunately, nobody has figured out an actual pragmatic way of figuring out what does integrated water management means on ground. We keep hearing things of mainstreaming things, of making this common knowledge. But when you look at the policy in depth, be the National Water Policy, or even with respect to droughts, you'll have to look at the National Disaster Management Plan, NDMP. There is no mention of the details and the specifics of how IWRM can be implemented or can be achieved. And that is a major issue. There have been enough literature. Asid Biswas is an expert on this, who has written extensively about the policy of why IWRM is an approach that is just what he calls it. It's a feel-good approach, but it does not work on ground. So going back to the ground part, that is where I think I would like to touch base on what Siddharth was talking like. And I also mentioned to one of the panelists, Aarti, that there have been a lot of movements on ground. Jal Sahelis is an organization. It's a movement by women who have come about in Bundelkhand to restore water, to harvest rainwater, and they have been successful in doing that. This is also along with what Siddharth mentioned, with different farmers doing different way of managing water. Unfortunately, none of these approaches, be it the historical infrastructure or these local initiatives, find a mention in the policies. And that's a very complex so-called system to navigate and to address. Again, I don't have a clear-cut answer, but I think a lot of movements, ground-up initiatives, and so-called the constant activism by not just the civil society, but by also people on the webinar, people who are interested in these things, need to constantly talk about these things. So yeah.
Thanks so much, Shiela and Radhika. That was a great way to end. This has been a really enriching, illuminating discussion. I've learned a lot. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to address all the questions, but a lot of them were about, various ways in which we can incorporate local participation. I don't think any of us have the answers, but it's going to be an ongoing thing, and I hope we'll keep studying it. I'm going to hand over, so there's going to Noreen to wrap up, and she's going to give us the participants. Thank you all for your questions and for participating. A link to Shiela and Radhika's exhibition, so where we can see a lot more and learn a lot more about their work. So Noreen, over to you to close and share the link with the exhibition.
Thank you, Shahana, and thank you all for participating and staying on for the extra time. We had a really engaging conversation with everyone today. As you can see on the screen, we're just sharing this link, and we'll follow up with each of you in an email afterwards as well. This is a link to an online virtual exhibition of the photos that document the walk that both Radhika and Shahel did. So we'll be following up with this in an email as well. Thank you all. Take care. Bye.